Welcome, everybody. My name is Dave Marcotte, and I'm the director of the Washington Institute for Public Affairs Research. We're happy you joined us here today to kick off the new year. When planning this event, there were a number of things we wanted to accomplish and bridges we had to cross. Among the bridges was arranging a space, and with the help of the School of Communications, we were able to get this great space in McKinley, and they handled pretty much everything for us. The only thing we had to worry about was after we made up our signs and issued our invitations, we were a little concerned they might change the name to the Denali Building, but that didn't happen, thankfully. But what we had in mind for this event was the inauguration of an occasional series of experts on policy issues that will be at the forefront of political debates in 2016 and on the highest list of priorities for the new administration inaugurated in 2017. So to this end, it became quickly apparent that education should be the topic for today. Not only is that obvious because education is of paramount importance, but across the board, from federal and state laws and policies that shape education are being rewritten as we speak. It's not an exaggeration to say that the transformations that law, policy, and history have in store for education over the next few years are unprecedented in recent history. We're in the midst of a push for universal pre-K education. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, most recently reauthorized as NCLB, is being reauthorized right now. The Higher Education Act, which governs the use of federal funds in higher education, is currently being rewritten. So think about it, the two most important pieces of federal legislation that affect education, which are usually kicked down the road when it comes time for policy debates, are being reauthorized at the same time. All of this has occurred while the administration has not been idle. In response to the consternation about rising tuition costs in higher education, the Department of Education's gainful employment provisions affecting institutions receiving federal student financial aid just went into effect this summer after a fair amount of legal wrangling by for-profit colleges, and with some threat that this is going to be blocked in the future. So with so many pieces in motion, from pre-K to the University of Phoenix, we're glad you have joined us today to talk about all these issues confronting both politicians as they campaign for 2016, and policymakers, and parents, students, and educators in the years beyond. So we're delighted today to have a panel of world-renowned scholars to help illuminate these issues. Our panelists are going to cover each of these four topics from pre-K, K-12, higher ed, and then for-profit education. In turn, and I'm going to introduce them to you in the order in which they will speak on these topics. The first and closest to me is Taryn Morrissey. Taryn is an assistant professor at the School of Public Affairs here at AU. Her work focuses on examining policies for vulnerable children, the income gap and the achievement gap, and the impacts of neighborhood poverty on young children's development. She received her PhD in developmental psychology from Cornell University, and she joined the AU faculty in 2010, but was on leave from January 2013 through August 2014 when she was serving as a senior advisor at the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where she worked primarily on the President's Early Learning Initiative, including Early Head Start and child care. In her still young career, Dr. Morrissey has published 20 articles in journals such as Pediatrics, Journal of Marriage and Family, and Child Development. Sitting next to Taryn is Tom Dee. Tom is a professor at Stanford University's Graduate School of Education and the director of the Stanford Center for Education and Policy Analysis. He has also just begun a term as the Associate Dean for Faculty in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford. He serves on too many editorial boards to count, including the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management, Education Evaluation and Policy Analysis, and the Educational Researcher, and he's on the board of directors of the Association for Education Policy and Finance. His recent and ongoing studies have been on school accountability under NCLB, waiver-based reforms, federal-sponsored school turnarounds, and he's also been working on a performance-based teacher compensation study right here in Washington, D.C. Professor D received his PhD in economics at the University of Maryland, College Park, and he served on the faculties of the University of Virginia, Swarthmore, and Georgia Tech. He's published more than 40 papers in the top journals in economics and public policy and received more honors and research grants than I could count. It's also the case that Tom was a college football player, so it's hard to imagine what the counterfactual had been if he hadn't had his head hit so many times as a young man. Next to Tom is Matt Chingos. He's a senior fellow at the Urban Institute. Though he finished graduate school and moved to Brookings just 5 years ago, he's among the most widely cited and respected scholars in DC and the nation on a wide range of education policy questions, both at the K-12 and higher education and post-secondary levels. In higher ed, his work is focused on student loan debt and college graduation rates. Chingos' first book, Crossing the Finish Line, Completing College in America's Public Universities, was co-authored with William Bowen and Michael McPherson and published by the Princeton University Press. He's also published in many prominent academic journals, including JPAM, Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis, and Education, Finance, and Policy. Matt's current research examines time to degree and the potential of information to change the market for higher education, which is going to be relevant for conversation today. Dr. Chingos received his PhD in government from Harvard. And Stephanie Cellini, on the far end, is an associate professor of public policy and public administration and economics at George Washington University. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution and faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Her research interests are wide-ranging in education and labor and public finance. Some of her research, recent research focuses on the labor market returns to for-profit education, which we'll talk about principally today, and on the responses of the for-profit post-secondary sector on changes in financial and state federal financial aid programs. Her work has been published in top journals like QJE, JPAM, and the American Economic Journal, and she's also co-authored a book with AU's own Bob Lerman entitled Demography, Education, and the Workforce. She received her PhD in economics at UCLA. So I'm going to step aside and let the panelists speak to you for about 10 minutes each in that order that I just introduced them. And then when they're done, I'll come back and moderate a few questions and discussion among the panelists, and then there'll be time for questions from the audience following that. So please welcome Taryn Morrissey.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm really honored and flattered to be grouped among this wonderful panel. Is there feedback on the mic, or is that better? Okay. I'm honored to be a part of it, and really thank Dave for putting this together and for inviting me to join it. So today I'll be talking about early childhood education, so the period before entry into kindergarten. Specifically, I'll discuss 7 common findings across research and how that might relate to current and future policy directions. So one is that the gap in achievement begins really early. This figure shows that children's vocabulary at 16 months of age, at 24 months of age, and 36 months of age by their parents' educational attainment. So you can see that the, let's see if there's a, there we go. This red line is children with parents who graduated college. They know about 1,200 words on average at 36 months of age. Children in this light pink line know about 1/3 of the number of words, 400 at 36 months of age. So this is quite early, and this is quite stark. There's evidence that this gap begins as early as 9 months of age in terms of cognitive test scores. So put another way, this is the school readiness gap at kindergarten entry. So this red dotted line at the top is what's considered optimal development, and these lines to the side are where children are scoring by income. So at the bottom left, you see that children in the bottom 20% or bottom quintile of, in terms of family income, are scoring quite lower, much lower than children in the top 20%. And notably, only children in that top quintile of family income are scoring at optimal development in math, reading, and general knowledge scores. So this gap is wide at kindergarten entry. It persists through K through 12 and beyond, and it's really expensive and very, very difficult to narrow. So a second kind of common finding is that attending high-quality early care and education can improve children's school readiness and help narrow this achievement gap by income. This figure is from Greg Duncan, who's an economist at the University of California, Irvine, and he's gathered basically meta-analysis of early interventions. And this figure shows the effect sizes of multiple kinds of early care and education interventions by years in which they occurred and the size of the effect. So a couple of points. One is that you can see most of them are positive, right? The average is above 0. The findings are positive and significant in general. There are some negative effects. This red one is most recent from Boston Pre-K, but you can see Perry Preschool is often pretty well known in terms of early interventions. It happened in the 1960s, very, very strong positive effects at the end of the intervention. Abecedarian, another example of that. A second point to note is that this effect size has slightly decreased over time. One hypothesized reason for that is because in the 1960s, the control group, the people who the Perry Preschool intervention group were compared to, really didn't attend preschool-like settings. They were probably at home with parents or relatives, whereas for the Head Start intervention, for example, the control group largely attended very Head Start-like settings, preschool settings. And the randomization actually in that study was such that many of the control group kids actually attended Head Start, so it was pretty problematic. And one note, when I say early care and education, I refer to both center-based childcare, what's considered kind of full-day childcare, as well as preschool, because from the child's perspective, a high-quality childcare center should be very, very similar, or they should get the same things out of it as a preschool. So 3 is that high-quality early care and education is a good financial investment. These short-term impacts at the end of the intervention translate into long-term impacts from these intensive high-quality programs. You can see the return on investment for something like Perry Preschool has been very, very high. We can follow those people for decades because this intervention occurred in the 60s. Abecedarian also occurred in the 1980s. And these savings or these positive ROIs come in the form of decreased criminal justice expenses, increased earnings over the lifetime, increased income taxes paid, delayed pregnancy. Now the bad news is that most early care and education in this country is not of high quality. We have the figure on the left shows that many kids in preschool spend their time doing many routine activities. And even though routine activities can incorporate some lessons, they don't necessarily always. This figure on the right is the environmental quality scores of 5 or above being high quality. Fewer than a quarter were of high quality. And then other bad news, much of it's not high quality because it's really expensive. For this Abecedarian was multiple years, but it's still about $50,000 per kid in 2014 dollars. So we spend Head Start, we spend about $12,000 per year. So it's not quite fair to expect those same return on investments from Head Start as we do from these other programs. The good news again, public investment and attention to early childhood has really increased in recent years. We have a lot of states and localities really stepping up to the plate. Oklahoma and Georgia in the 1990s were the first to create universal preschool programs that have shown really positive impacts. And more recently, several cities have implemented it. Just last Wednesday, New York City had its first day of pre-K classes. And a lot of local debates or mayoral races, like the New York City mayoral race, pre-K was a big issue. And there's been a lot of federal investment. So there's attention to infants and toddlers, really young kids with more early Head Start. There's grants to states. There's extension of the home visiting program. There's also one thing I didn't note on the slide was there's the reauthorization of the Child Care and Development Block Grant happened last year, and that really put a lot of more regulations on health and safety of kids in child care. And there's just increasing rhetoric. I mean, President Obama has been very outspoken about his support for preschool for all, so making preschool freely available to all kids for 200% and below. And just last year at the State of the Union, he proposed a child care guarantee to help families pay for child care. And Secretary Clinton has been, this has been a big issue for her for more than 20 years. She was the first, she held the first early education summit at the White House back in the 1990s. But the other presidential candidates have talked about it too. And as I said, in the state and local level, these are really big issues as well. So I certainly expect it to continue, which leads me to my final slide, is that public support for investment in early childhood is high. About 7 in 10 Americans, or likely voters from Gallup, favor using federal dollars for this purpose. Notably, though, this is much lower than the percentage who support using federal dollars for K through 12 or for higher ed. So it's still not quite at the same caliber, or Americans are still more hesitant about public federal investment in early childhood, but it's certainly been increasing. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for coming, folks. I was going to begin by noting, Dave mentioned I played college football, but I should point out it was Division III. So I think any respectable high school team could have beaten that college team. So I thought I'd get started kind of in the insipid way people always motivate talks about K through 12 education. First with like a basic international comparison. If we look at data from the PISA, we see that, and across lots of different tests as well, the comparative knowledge of US students is at best mediocre. For example, below the OECD average in math literacy. And so having said that, why do I hate starting talks with that kind of fact? Well, it becomes kind of a Rorschach test, and people project onto those kind of stylized facts any preconceptions they might have about the state of American public education and what, if anything, we should do about it. Now, the stylized facts that kind of hit me emotionally more are the ones that engage the kind of inequities that Taryn identified in early childhood that keep persisting all the way through K through 12 education and eventually into the labor market. So for example, if we look at the NAEP in grade 8 math, we see that Black and Hispanic students are on average, so this is the average for the entire population, 2 to 3 years of learning behind their white peers. Sometimes it gets framed as, 0.6 standard deviations, 0.8 standard deviations, but I think reframing that with our empirical benchmarks as years of learning gives you a sense of how they're lagging behind and what a sort of dramatic and unconscionable inequity that is. And also if we look at high school dropout rates, Black and Hispanic students drop out at twice the rate as their white peers, and we could go on and on. Minority students are highly overrepresented among those diagnosed with learning disabilities, et cetera. So these kind of stylized facts, all of them, typically motivate both anti-poverty as well as school improvement initiatives. And there are really kind of two broad camps in the kind of zeitgeist around ed policy reform. One you may have heard of is the broader Boulder movement, and they basically argue that, look, so much of the gaps that exist occur even before school starts. We're expecting too much of schools to ask them to remediate the severe poverty that washes up to the schoolhouse door. And there's something, I think, very compelling about that argument. The other sort of broad camp in the public discourse around policy is commonly called no excuses. And they've argued that we need to hold schools to a higher standard in terms of helping disadvantages, being agents of reducing inequality. And I find some things compelling about that as well. Yet the rhetoric, and this is something that really frustrates me in translating the research into the policy discussion, the policy rhetoric sometimes suggests we somehow have to choose between these two alternatives. And my view is that that's a false choice, right? We can work to design and implement effective policies that both focus on school readiness and have anti-poverty components, as well as try to improve how functioning and how transformational schools can be. Because we've seen evidence that schools can be transformational in the lives of at-risk kids. Now, on average, for example, the US experience with charter schools suggests the median charter school appears to be no more or less effective than the public school it replaces. But within that diverse set of charter schools, we do see one set, and they're the ones typically thought of as no excuses types of schools, that seem to be transformational in the lives of at-risk kids. And the evidence in support of that meets a high standard of rigor because we're able to identify the effects of school, those kinds of schools, by leveraging the randomization off lottery wait lists for who gets into them. Now, that doesn't mean we should think of that as a scalable model, at least to my mind, but it does point out the capacity of schools to be agents of change. And I worry a little bit when I hear people really pushing on the meme of let's not expect too much of schools. Because the one thing I like to remind people of is like, let's step back and think of all the things that are in an anti-poverty arsenal. Schools have to be near the top of the list because we'd like to think we'd have kids in school for 12 years where it's 7 hours a day, 180 days a year. There are no set of pediatrician office visits or caseworker activity that is going to have that granular person-to-person kind of contact with disadvantaged kids on a regular basis. So when I hear people trying to walk back from what schools can do, that worries me as much as I think we should also be worrying about the anti-poverty issues. And one of my colleagues likes to refer to this as sort of the walking and chewing gum theory. Like we can worry about both, we can be concerned about both. Okay, so let's move on to one prominent and controversial effort to improve schools. Test-based accountability. We typically yoke it to No Child Left Behind, but it actually began at the state level 25 years ago. In the early 90s, states began of their own volition rolling out test-based accountability, generally of two stripes. One, linking it to some type of consequences, if only a sanction to say this isn't good enough. And others just collected the information and put it out there, what people call report card accountability, but without attaching any normative valence or explicit sanction to it. And then just 14 years ago, 13 years ago in 2002, we scaled up that type of accountability with the No Child Left Behind Act. And again, the basic theory behind this wasn't, the proponents weren't there. It's hard to imagine now. It was a broad bipartisan centrist coalition. Does anyone remember those? They used to exist in American politics that supported this proposal. And again, the idea wasn't that we hate schools or we hate teachers. It was just that schools, particularly those serving the most disadvantaged kids, aren't operationally high functioning to the extent they could. In terms of organizing their practices, their culture, their pedagogy around unlocking the potential of the kids in front of them. And it's interesting, if you ever go to some of the sliver of charter schools, these no excuses ones, that seem to be doing great things with at-risk kids, they really kind of have this culture of high expectations that appears to become a self-fulfilling reality. But, so anyway, I'm not here to kind of plant a flag in NCLB as a wonderful policy. It was a 1.0 federal effort to scale up accountability, and it had real flaws. It focused exclusively on test scores and not other metrics we might care about with regard to student progress. It had this moonshot rhetoric that we're going to get all kids proficient by 2014 that a wiser perspective might have argued against. And it also had these targets of AYP as opposed to helping schools get better over time. They had to sort of get to the proficiency level regardless of where they began. So we could go on and on about its flaws, but let's take a moment. I just want to take a moment to say a little bit about what the research evidence says. Because if you were to listen to the popular rhetoric and how hated this policy seems to be now, you would think the evidence shows it was really ineffective. When in fact, I think a fair reading of the evidence shows just the opposite. So in particular, if you're looking for something you might think of as kind of unbiased in this vein, I would encourage you to look at a recent National Academy of Science report on test-based accountability that privileged studies, including some work I did with my colleague Brian Jacob at Michigan, looking at the effects of NCLB, and also some work by Tom Cook and colleagues that leveraged the fact that states differed in how they took NCLB on. Some states already had test-based accountability prior to NCLB. Others didn't. For those states that didn't have it before, NCLB catalyzed a de novo experience with school accountability. So we've got kind of treatment and control groups through which we can identify the effects, and we do see positive gains, particularly in fourth grade math, of non-trivial sizes of like 0.08 standard deviations up to like 0.25. And that's a huge fraction of those 2 to 3 year learning gaps I just described. So, the research, which lamentably doesn't, people don't necessarily pay that much attention to, is at odds with, I think, the reality. So where are we now? Well, right now, I mean, we've had this experience where everyone knew NCLB was flawed, but the political reality didn't allow the White House or Congress to actually move on the reauthorization. And it was year after year, we're going to take up reauthorization. It became like waiting for Godot. But instead, they were diverted by the healthcare debate, by a recession, by foreign policy issues. But now they appear to be finally taking it up. There are both Senate and House bills that have been moved into conference on reauthorizing NCLB, and an expectation that they will come out of conference for a vote and possible consideration by the White House. And what we're hearing is it's likely that the accountability provisions are going to be weakened. And this has raised a lot of criticisms, in particular from national civil rights groups that worry that if we stop having a little bit of bite to the accountability, if we don't have systems that hold people accountable for educating their most disadvantaged students, that we're going to lose those gains that we've seen. But admittedly, those gains fell short of the rhetoric, so I don't want to oversell what NCLB did. But there's concern about this, and I think I want to frame this more broadly, because I think we're at something of an inflection point in education policy in the K through 12 area right now, where the impetus for reform has kind of lost its steam. And the centrist coalition has broken down. And instead, we've got these odd political bedfellows. The ones pushing a kind of neutered accountability is ironically a coalition of what I would characterize as Tea Party Republicans and teacher unions, who both hate the prior policies and aren't interested in fixing it in any sort of reasonable way for very different reasons. The folks on the right worry about this was kind of a federal overreach into state and local politics, and teacher unions just are no fans of these types of policies at all. So I think one of the things we need to be thinking about looking forward, and that was sort of the charge we had here, is what's going to be the role for the federal government. When it comes to NCLB, my sort of position was in the mend it, don't end it camp. Like, let's find ways to fix it and make it more sensible. The basic theory of change seems to have some traction to it. Obviously, the details of that 1.0 policy are objectionable in many ways, but we think we can do better. But I also think we need to step back for a moment, and those of us who have seen some good things in this unusual era where the federal government has been exceptionally prescriptive about school reform, need to acknowledge that there's only so much the federal government can do. There's a point where federal activity becomes pushing a string, because our system is highly decentralized, and that's a great thing in many ways. We've got 15,000 school districts operating 100,000 public schools in this country. So, and that creates a lot of implementation challenges that differs across these schools, and I've seen that in the studies I've done with stimulus spending programs under the Obama administration, and in studying what's going on under waivers. And by the way, the stasis around reauthorizing NCLB has effectively ceded authority to the executive branch, because Arne Duncan could just go and say, you didn't meet your proficiency requirement? Well, implement our vision for what accountability should be, and we'll write you a waiver from the provision. Now, I'm seeing some positive things in some states, less so in others, and that's a reminder that there's only so much the federal government can do to drive change at scale, because the state and local context matters. And so what do I see in the future? I'd like to see a strong federal role that focuses in particular on ensuring basic constitutional liberties. That's through things like IDEA, the federal legislation for kids with special learning needs. It's through things like Title I that try to support funding equity. It's through things like Title IX that try to support gender equity, et cetera. But I was a fan of much of what the government did under Race to the Top, under stimulus spending, not because I believe those programs were great before I saw them, but I saw those kinds of initiatives as part of the fundamental role of the federal government to try to seed information, to try to promote basic research and knowledge that might be something we could scale up elsewhere. And for all the Sturm und Drang, for example, around the 5 or 6 million that was spent on Race to the Top, for example, people forget that was 5 or 6% of $100 billion in Department of Ed spending under the stimulus bill. So husbanding a small part of that to try to promote innovation, I thought was exactly the kind of thing the government should do to create kind of leading models that can drive change at scale. But then the other final part of this, and I'll leave this as my last comment, is again, with this decentralized system, I think we're also going to have to find ways to look to states and localities to drive reform and create leading examples of how it can be done within unique context, because the context matters. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dave, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming to hear us talk about education policy today. So it's a pretty good time to run your mouth about education policy, particularly higher education policy for a living, because between now and the election next November, you're going to hear more about higher education than probably any presidential campaign in recent memory, or perhaps ever. And as Dave noted, the Higher Education Act, which is the main way the federal government is involved in colleges and universities, is going to be taken up by the Congress in the next year. And the reason for all this attention is that the public is concerned about college affordability, about rising student debt loads. So presidential candidates in both parties more or less have no choice but to respond. And I think the HEA reauthorization might be more ambitious than usual. I don't think it's going to be the usual reauthorization of a major piece of legislation where you kind of clean out some of the cobwebs and have some minor innovations. I think there might be larger decisions and more ambitious reforms on the table. And Dave couldn't have picked a better day to hold this event, because since last Thursday, there have been three of the biggest developments in higher education policy in recent years. First, last Thursday, a new paper was released by the Brookings Institution on student loans. And for the first time, the federal government made data available that link the information it holds on federal student borrowers, who constitute the vast majority of student borrowers in this country, to earnings records held by the Internal Revenue Service. So basically, the federal government holds most of the $1.3 trillion in outstanding student loan debt, but until last week hadn't told us very much about the health of that loan portfolio, whether who was in trouble, how many people were in trouble, and so on and so forth. So those data have now been made available in summary form in this important paper that tells us a lot about where the problems in the student loan market are. And one big area of problems is in the for-profit sector, which Stephanie's going to talk about a little bit more later. Development number two was a big data dump that happened at 6 a.m. on Saturday morning. This is what used to be, or was going to be, the college rating system that President Obama opposed 2 years ago. They realized, wisely in my opinion, that that wasn't such a great idea for the government to be in the business of rating colleges, particularly with the data that were available. So they made better data available, once again linking education records held by the Department of Education with earnings records held by the Internal Revenue Service, that now enable you to go online and see for most any college in the country what the average earnings are of graduates, graduation rates, repayment of loans, so on and so forth. Certainly not the last thing we need for information in higher education, but an important first step. And then the third thing was announced yesterday, and that's to amend the federal student aid eligibility formula, and as a result the process, to use what's called prior year, which sounds like this nerdy technical thing that you shouldn't care about. But it's the difference between filing your federal aid application in February or March and having to wait until your parents or you file your tax return for the prior year, which was the old way of doing things. And the new way of doing things, which is you can use your tax data from the prior year, so you can fill out your financial aid application in October and get much better information about college costs much sooner than was possible before. So that's kind of what's happened just in the last couple of days. But these all feed into some bigger issues in higher education policy that I think are going to feature prominently in both the presidential campaign and in discussions around the authorization of the Higher Education Act. So I'm going to do just a very quick rundown of 5 big issues. There are certainly others. The first is free college and debt-free college. These ideas have been bandied about, beginning with President Obama a couple of years ago in a proposal for free community college, free 2 years of college, and now by more or less all the Democratic candidates for president have picked up on this idea that we should make college free or debt-free. Turns out free and debt-free are pretty different ideas. Free means free. It's unclear exactly what it means. It's, well, free for who, free where, but usually it's some variation on you can go to a particular college, usually a public college, and you don't pay anything for tuition and fees. But you still have to pay living expenses, so it may not feel free for someone who doesn't have a lot of income to cover those expenses. Debt-free, the idea is more that college, and this is embodied more in Hillary Clinton's higher education plan, that you should be able to get through college without having to borrow, or at least get through some colleges without having to borrow. but that means making a payment that's affordable for everyone. Now, we have no idea what affordable means in the Clinton plan because there aren't details yet at this stage. So the kind of contrast here is between a policy that's free for everyone, which is more simple, transparent, which has some benefits, but it's less well targeted because it goes to everyone, and having college just be more affordable, which is less simple, involves 8 applications, and is going to be more complicated, which has some downsides, but can be more targeted. So for a given level of public support, can provide resources to students who need it more and whose behavior is more likely to be affected. Second policy area is innovation, regulation, and accountability. So around regulation, I think at the same time we have too little and we have too much. So I think we're going to see the Republicans more likely to talk about the areas in which we have too much regulation, which is that it's too hard for new actors to get into higher education. Someone has a great idea to start an awesome new college. There are all these barriers around accreditation that make that very, very difficult to do. At the same time, we have too little regulation about once you get in, once you're accredited and you're operating, it's very hard to get kicked out. So that's where a lot of the debate around some of the for-profit colleges comes in, and that's where we're more likely to hear the Democrats hammer on how we're not doing enough to keep bad actors, predatory colleges, and so on out of business. Policy area number 3 is improving the market through better information. This is an area that's bipartisan support. Senator Rubio, candidate for president, has a bipartisan bill in Congress on this subject. The Obama administration obviously made a huge contribution over the weekend in adding information. And the idea here is that students are making choices without good information about colleges, about really thinking about college as a financial decision, or in large part a financial decision, and thinking about what are their chances of graduating and how much are they likely to make in the labor market so they can decide whether to go to college, where to go to college, how much to pay for it, and how much to borrow. There's still a big question about what kind of information potential students need and whether just putting it out there on its own, as the Obama administration has done, is going to be enough. I think it's an area where we're finally starting to see a shift towards outcomes of colleges rather than just inputs, sort of K-12 education with something of a 20-year lag. This is where the K-12 education debate was in the 1990s, really thinking about how much schools are spending and class size and whatnot, and that really shifted towards looking at outcomes like test scores, high school graduation rates, and whatnot. So I think it's a positive development that higher ed is starting to slowly catch up and not just talk about how much colleges are spending and how many kids are in the average lecture hall, and focus on, are people graduating, are they getting degrees that are worth something and enable them to pay off their debt. Area number 4 is refinancing student loans. This is an idea that was popularized by Senator Warren over the last year or so. It's been picked up by the Clinton campaign. It's a really nice political talking point because these politicians can go out there and they say, well, you can refinance your mortgage, you can refinance your car. How come you can't refinance your student loans? Well, the truth is you can refinance your student loans, but because the government gives people a pretty good deal on them, most private banks don't want to refinance them because they're subsidized by the government. So it makes for a nice political talking point. The problem with it is that the benefit that the government cutting interest rates on student loans would give is proportional to the amount of loans you have. And it turns out that loans are very concentrated among affluent folks. So the top 20% of the country in terms of income hold somewhere between about 35% of the student loan debt. So this refinancing proposal, which is bandied about by progressive politicians, turns out to be quite regressive in terms of who it would benefit. The same way a tax cut across the board benefits the wealthy more than the less well-off. A student loan interest rate reduction would do the same thing. The last area that's going to get a lot of attention is income-driven repayment. As folks are finding themselves struggling to pay back their student loans, the best option for them to turn to is not a small reduction in their interest rate, which provides a very small benefit, but getting into a program where they can make payments based on their incomes. Now, this program already exists. In fact, there's, I think, 5 or 6 different flavors of it the government already offers. But it's very complicated, can be difficult to enroll in, you have to recertify every year. So there's a number of proposals, including one co-sponsored, once again, by Marco Rubio from Florida, to make income-driven repayment automatic, streamlined. And the idea, I think the key concern there is to do it in a way that sustains this important safety net for students, but does not bankrupt taxpayers with generous forgiveness provisions where you get your student loan debt wiped out after a not very long period of time, and in a way that makes students care about the cost of college. You don't want to say, well, you just get in this program, you don't got to worry about how much you're paying, because that makes it easier for colleges to keep jacking up their prices. So I think we're going to see in higher education policy a mix of areas of agreement, areas like simplification of existing programs, the need to hold down costs, more better information. Those are ideas that have support on both sides of the aisle. And also areas of disagreement around how much the government, particularly the federal government, should be involved in subsidizing college and university students. Whether benefits should be targeted to students who need the help the most, or whether they should be spread more broadly, shared more broadly, and about the appropriate level of regulation. So I want to conclude on what I think is kind of a key point here, which is that for a given political philosophy or set of policy preferences, there are opportunities for making policies that are better or worse. So if you think that free college is really the way to go, I think you want to think very carefully about how do you design that policy in a way that it helps people the most and minimizes unintended consequences. If instead you think free college is a terrible idea, and really we need to fix the market by better information, make the market less dysfunctional, once again, there's ways to do that better and ways to do it less well. So I think it's going to be an interesting ride over the next 14 months or so, and I hope that there'll be focus on good policy making in addition to the ideological ideas. So thanks, and look forward to your questions.
All right. Do you know where they are? Oh, perfect. Oh, great. So thanks for having me, Dave. Thanks for organizing. And that was a perfect lead-in, Matt. That was great. So I'm going to focus here on for-profit colleges. I'm calling it for-profit colleges in the crosshairs because, like no other time in our history, we are targeted and focused and scrutinizing this sector like never before. Okay, so, it moved a little bit. Okay, so it says what are for-profit colleges at the top, and I've put some examples here. You've probably heard of a lot of these, University of Phoenix, DeVry, Strayer. We're not talking about GW and AU and those schools. Those are not for-profit. You might have heard of this one here called Trump Entrepreneur Initiative, formerly known as Trump University. I don't know if you read the Post this morning. There's an interesting article there. So we're talking about it in part because of that one. This sector there's a number of lawsuits ongoing, if you haven't read that article, about Donald Trump's now defunct university. But there's also lots of other smaller institutions that are for-profit colleges that you may not have heard of. There's thousands of these, really. The Potomac Massage Training Institute, I thought was a good kind of random example. Empire Beauty Schools, there's a lot of cosmetology, other types of vocational type training in this sector. The Cordon Bleu Culinary. And just a huge range of actors in this space. So to give you a little bit of background, there's more than 2,500 of these schools serving over 2 million students in the US, and that's up 300% over just the last 10 years or so. So huge growth in this sector. And for-profits may provide an important pathway to college for underserved and non-traditional students. Particularly, they serve a disproportionate share of women, minorities, veterans, single parents, and of course working students. You've probably seen the commercials for all these things, advertising for working students in particular. And they may actually spur innovation in higher education overall. So you've heard, we all know about online coursework, and University of Phoenix and the others were some of the innovators there. But on the other side, they have high tuition, around $14,000 a year for mostly associates and certificate programs. So pretty high, especially when you compare it to a community college, where average tuition is about $4,000, I think, right now, for an associate's degree from a public institution. They also get lots of federal student aid. On average, they get about 75% of their revenue through federal student aid programs, and that's not even counting the veterans aid that they're getting through the GI Bill and other veterans programs. So quite a bit of federal student aid going to these colleges, which is one big reason why we're concerned about regulation and what's happening to taxpayer dollars here. These schools also have very high default rates on student loans, and Matt mentioned this new study that has looked at maybe for-profit colleges are one reason why we've seen default rates go up. Greater than 20% of those loans of for-profit students are defaulted on. And then these schools have lower completion earnings and employment outcomes in other sectors. And that's kind of newer research that it's kind of still in its infancy, but we're finding kind of these slightly lower outcomes for these colleges. And on top of that, I guess the very bottom of my slide doesn't show up, but I did have another bullet point down there. Something got all realigned here. But that there's kind of this evidence of some of these schools misleading students and potentially perpetrating fraud in financial aid programs. There was a big, in 2010, there was a GAO report that alleged some of these misleading students and fraud, and the Senate Health Committee followed up with some other investigations. So there were these investigations around 2010. So that led to a crackdown. The Obama administration has recently put into place these kind of controversial new gainful employment regulations. This is going to, really for the first time, restrict eligibility for federal student aid to programs within for-profit colleges, program by program, based on the loan payment to earnings ratios of their graduates. So now this is this focus on outcomes. How are we going to, look at outcomes? Is that the right thing to measure? Lots of questions around that. But basically, colleges can now lose aid if their loan payment to earnings ratios of their recent grads is greater than 12% of annual income or greater than 30% of discretionary income for 2 out of 3 years. That's kind of the technical stuff. But basically, if your students can't pay back their loans, you're going to be in trouble. So the Department of Ed predicts that 16% of programs will fail the metrics here. So that's quite a few. And they think that some, if not many, for-profit colleges will close their doors. There's a lot of smaller colleges. Many of them will close their doors. On the other hand, it may be that some of these schools can operate without federal student aid. In fact, Trump University, I don't think, had federal student aid. They may invest more in instruction. We could hope that they think more about that. They may practice more selective admissions, maybe not admitting as many high-risk students, which could be good or bad. And they might switch to nonprofit status. We've actually seen a number of colleges trying to avoid this regulation by changing their from for-profit to nonprofit, or eliminating poor-performing programs, or switching those programs to programs that were, they weren't so at risk of losing aid for them. Longer-term programs. Okay, so there was this crackdown, all this talk about gainful employment, a lot of negative publicity, federal investigations, and then we kind of see this shakeup. There were a number of federal investigations and lawsuits against individual for-profit colleges that you've probably heard about in the news. So Corinthian colleges, you might have heard about. It lost its federal student aid, closed campuses, declared bankruptcy. 16,000 students are now, without degrees, without their, without their education. And these students will be allowed to discharge their debt. And 12,000 students have made claims so far, totaling about $3 billion of debt forgiveness. So this is a big deal, and sets a big precedent for others that close. Are we going to be on the hook for these student loans, especially if students can show that they were defrauded by the university or misled? But basically, across the board, enrollments are down in for-profits, whether it's part of gainful employment or this shakeup or a few getting investigated, or maybe it's the economy or other reasons. But enrollment is down in the for-profits across the board. University of Phoenix reported its enrollment's been down 50% in the last 5 years. So huge growth up through maybe 2010, 2011, and then things are just going way down. It still enrolls 225,000 students, the largest single higher education institution in the country. All right, so what's on the table for 2016? There's a lot of talk about funding the gainful employment mandate or the gainful employment regulation, or defunding it. And the House GOP budget is actually not putting in funds for it. And should we fund federal investigations? Hillary Clinton has mentioned strengthening gainful employment and investing more in the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the FTC, and the DOJ to kind of go after these bad apples in the industry. So you can see, as Matt pointed out, it's like either going more regulation or less. So it's, what side are you on here? How do we fix the broken accreditation process? How do we balance this kind of need for innovation and allowing innovation in the for-profit sector with safeguarding students and taxpayers? And it really depends, what you think about, what side of the aisle you're on, or what you think about that balance. So, Marco Rubio has mentioned creating alternative accreditation pathways for low-cost, innovative providers, so non-traditional kind of education programs that could get through the kind of current accreditation process. Oh, we also have Scott Walker. You know, he recently proposed eliminating the Wisconsin State Regulatory Approval Board. So each state has its own regulatory body. And so he's clearly going in that direction of just do away with, do less regulation, more innovation. And then we've got Obama and Hillary Clinton coming down on saying, you know, we need stronger requirements for, you know, the accreditors to assess student outcomes in particular. So once they're in that accreditation process, you know, should we be catching them earlier and figuring out, looking at their outcomes, not just, you know, student-faculty ratios and those things. We want to look at outcomes again. So it's this move towards outcomes and how we, you know, can kind of best manage this balance between these. All right, there's been a number of risk-sharing proposals which have found support really on both sides of the aisle. People are talking about charging fees or forcing colleges to pay some % of the loans that students default on, and you know, kind of getting some skin in the game. And there has been this bipartisan Senate bill right now that a lot of folks are talking about. But how do you design that appropriately and think about all the incentives that those create? And it might give colleges an incentive to really invest in you know, these better outcomes for students and making sure their students are getting jobs and all that, and not defaulting on loans. And then, you know, as Matt mentioned, you know, federal support for public colleges. What is this kind of federal role? Should we offer tuition-free community college? Community colleges are the primary competitor or alternative for the for-profit students. And they seem to potentially have better outcomes. They're more tried and true, including work by Dave and others, that has found really good outcomes in the public sector for community college. And we're seeing, you know, questionable outcomes for the for-profit sector. Do we want to, you know, give an incentive to go to the public sector there? How are we going to design that? And of course, Hillary Clinton, she still is backing tuition-free community college or grants to states who will make that a reality. And then this no-loan tuition or debt-free tuition in the four-year colleges if students work about 10 hours a week. But again, you know, the higher income students will still pay affordable tuition, whatever that means. So this could have implications for the for-profit sector. All right, so candidates' views vary widely. It's unclear if the for-profit sector will continue its recent decline. But if it does, how will students be affected? Will they be saved from predatory colleges and insurmountable debt? Or are they going to be denied access to college and innovative training? It's a big question. All these questions kind of depend crucially on the extent to which the for-profit students can and will be absorbed into public colleges. My short answer is hopefully, to a large extent, they will be. If there are efforts by states and potentially the federal government to support public colleges, that might happen. I'm working on some research looking back at the 1990s and 80s when we actually had another for-profit regulation kind of crackdown, and it seems like there's some switching. If these students are not fully absorbed, we want to know whether a for-profit college education is better than no college education at all. And my short answer here, you know, the jury is still out. A lot of this research is still ongoing. But my short answer is it depends. It depends on what the type of certification is we're talking about. It depends on what the college is. It depends on a number of different criteria. You know, it depends on if they can find their needs met in a community college. So this work is ongoing. I'm actually working with some of this cool Treasury data connected to the Department of Ed data that I should be able to have an answer more about the quality of a for-profit education soon. So stay tuned on that and stay tuned for the election. All right, I will pass it over. All right. I get a new suit. Great.
Thanks so much, everybody. So I want to take the prerogative of the chair and start by asking the panel a few questions and encourage you all to think about questions that I'll ask you for in a moment. But as we move into the questions from the audience, I want to remind you that there are microphones I'll ask you to use that you can see Rachel over here that she'll be distributing them when we're ready to ask questions. But I do want to start with a couple observations on the comments from the panelists. And I'll start with the higher education for-profit world first and provide some context first to this question. What hasn't been talked about much, Stephanie alluded it to, and Matt, I think, was implied in this discussion about the role, the importance of community colleges in the post-secondary world. So about 40% of all kids in America start college in community colleges, and when we're thinking about what's free for all or debt-free college, mainly those policy mechanisms are to operate starting through community colleges. So community colleges are to be a really important part of this response if real money is on the table. It's an open question of whether or not we're going to come up with real money in my assessment. But the alternative here in the post-secondary world appears to be to bring up some of the lessons and tools used in K-12 accountability by giving information to consumers and letting them pick. And in the context of traditional K-12, the college scorecard and all the rest, let's give students some assessment, some sense of what they're going to pay, what they're going to earn, et cetera, and then let the market decide. At the same time, let's really crack down on some really bad apples in the for-profit world. And those are reasonably cheap interventions, and so I guess I'd like to hear your assessment of whether or not we, as a policy community or a government that's shaped by all kinds of fiscal restraints, is going to move anywhere in the higher ed world beyond providing more information and letting accountability work that way. The idea of going through mechanisms that encourage college for all was going to involve real money at the state level, a few investments on the part of the U.S. Department of Education that's just been announced as really small potatoes in terms of the overall picture. So I guess I'd like to hear Matt or Stephanie or Tom, anyone had thoughts about where higher ed reform is going to go in the next 5 years or so.
Want to go first, Matt?
Sure. I mean, I don't think we're going to see a lot of ambitious legislating that involves spending lots of money on anything for the foreseeable future, just kind of given political considerations. And I guess the one opportunity for something like that to happen would be in the context of a overhaul of a big piece of legislation like HEA in higher ed, where money could be moved around. Mm-hmm. So perhaps the government perhaps Congress would decide, well, in the course of streamlining all these programs, we're going to somehow make some existing programs cost less, and that's going to free up some money to pay for something else that we want to do. So if overall a package of reforms could be budget neutral, mm-hmm. I could imagine there being a way forward. But just going and saying we're going to pass a law and put a whole bunch of federal money into federal-state partnerships that reduce the tuition costs of college to students, as folks like President Obama and Bernie Sanders and the like have proposed, I don't see that happening. Oh, and we're going to pay for it with a tax on wealthy people.
Okay. And Stephanie, I guess I'll follow up with a question for you, which is, part of the pushback on the for-profits has one take on that is in the period right following the recession of 2008, 2009, community colleges just didn't have either the capacity or the flexibility to deal with the kind of educational demands that were apparent for workers that needed education delivered in different ways in different places. For-profits really stepped in. Now, you can argue that what was good and what was bad about that, but as for-profits withdraw, how do you think community colleges or four-year institutions are going to respond to that? Can they respond to that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question, and it's the subject of a lot of ongoing research. So will they get reabsorbed into the public sector? I mean, you would hope. I mean, my research has found that there's a lot of overlap that, I've been looking at the 1980s and 90s when, believe it or not, there were actually quite a few for-profits, and there was a crackdown based on cohort default rates, which default rates on student loans. And it looked like students were switching sectors quite a bit back then. Even in a place like California, where infrastructure investments in community college were very poor, it seemed like students, once they kind of heard about community colleges, heard about the programs, saw that there was going to be this investment, students would kind of move there instead of to the for-profit. So there was at least some portion of students who could find their needs met in a community college for a quarter of the price. So I think that's still possible, but we've seen major, state budget crises that have, the community colleges may be in even worse shape now. And I think it's still an open question, will they absorb those students? And I think we just don't know yet. I mean, I think it's really tough, and what proportion will be absorbed? Can they be? If students get this information, will students be able to, understand the information and interpret the information about placement rates and completion rates in the for-profit sector to really drive out the bad apples? Will they really be looking at, the White House college scorecard, Are students going to be looking at that, or are they looking at the 1-800 number on their TV screen and calling up and getting roped in? So I guess who knows? What happens now? We hope that some students could get reabsorbed into the public sector. If they don't, the question is, are they better off without having this huge debt and, and this degree that doesn't mean a whole lot, possibly?
So maybe we need to get the public sector to get some of the marketers where
That's right,
they
we
show
need the
people in their
marketers.
pajamas saying, I love
Advertising,
to learn at home while I'm in my pajamas.
Yeah,
And I can do that right at my community college.
That's right. Well, I'm at community college. They can do it. They just need the advertising.
Right.
That's right.
So a question for both Taryn and Tama. One reaction to your comments was, that I had was, there's some there's singles being hit here. There's real progress being made both in pre-K and K-12 education. But in pre-K, the counterfactual is constantly changing, so small is good, but we'd like more. Because after all, part of the promise of early childhood investment is this is where we should have the most leverage. If we're ever going to affect kids, it ought to be early on. Seeing smaller gains is disheartening somewhat, and seeing those gains dissipate is especially disheartening and cause for some pushback on whether or not we should expand Head Start in general. And thinking about Tom's point about the NCLB was federal accountability 1.0, but the moonshot rhetoric was so big that coming up with some really marginal but maybe not unimportant, but certainly not astounding results is just not good enough when you plan for 100% no child left behind by 2014. So our small gains, I guess my question is, or my thought is for you to take up is, are small gains good enough in educational policy? And are small gains a place where we can argue for anything? And so when we retrench in the world you described, Tom, anybody can argue for any policy intervention or pulling back any policy interventions because the costs aren't that great, or the opportunity costs aren't that great, or the benefits of expansion aren't that great.
Well, it's dangerous to use a baseball metaphor in Washington, D.C., where I know the Nationals have really underperformed this summer. So I think the small ball example, though, is a good one. And the moonshot rhetoric, I think, couldn't really ever be met, because I think we live in a world, especially in a decentralized system, where that's about as much as the federal government could do at scale to move changes on average. The meaningful but modest improvements that we saw under my study with Brian and several others. Now, my concern with where we are now, as there's the possibility of walking back accountability, and I should mention, touching on higher ed, prior to NCLB, there were accountability systems at the K through 12 level that were like the college scorecard data. It was just about pushing information out and hoping people would react to it in useful ways. And the available evidence suggests it didn't have an effect when it didn't have some type of normative content attached to it. Those accountability systems didn't really move the needle. But anyway, as we're now potentially walking back on accountability, again, because of the teachers unions as well as Tea Party Republicans both kind of coalescing around that, my concern is that we're going to lose those modest gains, and the a robust system of public education at the K through 12 level is going to wither, right? Because we're going to move back in a kind of atavistic way in terms of reform. And meanwhile, the folks on the right, the reason they want to walk this back is they think it's federal overreach, and they'd rather push for increased elements of choice through vouchers, through scaling up charters, not as, when charter schools began, the thought there was these are going to provide examples of innovations that work and that we could then seed back in the traditional public education sector. But the thrust behind them now by most of their advocates is this is kind of a shadow system that can maybe supplant traditional public schooling. So I think, small ball is what we could have expected, but as we begin to walk back from that, I worry we're going to lose a lot, especially if there's not some kind of new vigor that I'm not necessarily seeing that pervades state and local systems.
In parallel, in the accountability information policy aspect, that's been true in early childhood as well. There's a quality rating information systems, QRS, that states have implemented, trying to get information public about the quality of childcare centers and family childcare programs. And it hasn't moved parents necessarily. I mean, parents go toward what's convenient, what fits their particular needs. So unless it's attached to something else like money, and even tiered reimbursement for subsidies hasn't quite moved the needle in terms of quality or getting the bad programs out of the market too. But in terms of the small effects and the fade out effects, which is a common sort of criticism of early childhood, that we get these short-term effects. Some of them are large, some of them are moderate, some of them are small, but they tend to fade out as kids move through elementary school. So by third grade, for example, in the Head Start randomization study, there's no differences in cognitive scores between, or very, very few, between children who attended Head Start and children who didn't. I have a few responses to that. One being that it was 1 year of school for the most part. There were some kids in the Head Start study that attended 2 years. But do we expect the same effects for attending second grade, for example? Have you heard of anybody parsing out what the effect of second grade is on children's long-term cognitive outcomes? So that's one response. The other is that there are long-term effects. So the studies that we have long-term data for, including Head Start back in the 80s, or David Deming has done some really interesting work on this, showing that there are long-term gains, but we're not sure if they're sleeper effects or if we're not measuring the right interim outcomes. So we know that there are some effects, positive on grade retention. It's lower among kids who attend preschool. We know that there are effects on special education assignment, but there don't seem to be those interim effects on test scores. But then there are these positive effects on earnings long term. So is it a measurement issue? What's going on there is somewhat suspect. But these fade-out effects and these short-term small effects are one criticism that people have used against having pre-K. Another is just the fragmentation of the early childhood system. I mean, we have state and local governments starting pre-K systems, not necessarily the usual suspects too. We have Oklahoma and Georgia. But there's also the Department of Ed and the Department of Health and Human Services essentially both own some part of early childhood. You have Head Start out of HHS, you have pre-K out of Ed, and they don't always talk to each other, and there's multiple different programs. And so in this child care reauthorization just last year, there was a mandated report to Congress that's due in November about duplication and duplicative services in early childhood. So I think it's mostly going to be used politically, but there was a GAO report about it. And so one of the criticisms, particularly in the Republican side, is do we need another preschool program? And the reality is only 40% of eligible kids are served in Head Start. Only 4% are served in early Head Start. So we might not need another program, but we certainly need more services per se.
Well, we've started late, so I thank you for your patience. So I want to give you the opportunity to ask any questions of the panel. And if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and there's microphones that will be passed around. And as an additional incentive to stick around for a few more minutes, I realize we're running late. We have a reception set up on the rooftop upstairs, so we can enjoy some beautiful weather in just a few minutes. But questions? Rachel in the back. In the front.
So is this on? Chris Curran, I'm with the UMBC School of Public Policy. So first of all, Dave, thank you for organizing. I'll direct my question to, I guess, the higher ed individuals. So we talk about the reabsorption, right, of some of these for-profit students, and it seems like community college seems like one plausible mechanism for that. But at the same time, Dave has mentioned the kind of risk or unlikelihood, perhaps, of federal policies that would cost a lot to address some of this. So I'd love to hear you all talk a little bit about the role of online education. It seems like that's a potential innovation that actually comes out of the for-profit sector that could both reabsorb many of these students, but also potentially do so in a cost-efficient manner.
I'll go ahead. I mean, I'm very interested in knowing more about online and can it really lower the cost. From the research I've seen, I think it could lower the cost. The problem in the for-profit sector is that's great for them, but they keep that profit. So why lower your tuition? They've been keeping tuition high for the online programs. As far as I've been seeing, I've even been seeing other.
So maybe
yeah.
to clarify, could we do that in the public sector though?
Oh,
Right? So the
yeah.
University of Florida, Arizona State. Like
Could they
Georgia Tech,
create
Southern
low?
Masters,
That's right. And a lot of public community colleges and four-year, Arizona State, like, as we've heard advertised, actually a public advertising its programs. They have 70 programs online, completely online from Arizona State, that they claim are the same as their on-campus ones. So I think the research is still, again, in its infancy. Like, do we know that they're the same quality? Do we know that employers value them the same? Are they the same from University of Phoenix as they would be from Arizona State? I wish we knew. But can they lower, actually, MOOCs?
Yeah, I was
Anyway,
going to mention.
go, please.
I'm in the kind of white-hot
Wait,
center
yeah.
of all things around digitally mediated learning, because there's so many people at Stanford that are interested in this. And as Stephanie said, the research is in its infancy, but I've got one experiment in the field now that tries to look at the employment effects of having digital credentials listed on your resume, and does that move the needle? And the funny thing is, doing that in this space, what we're seeing preliminarily, the paper's not out yet, is that when we began that project a year or so ago, there seemed to be something stigmatizing about online credentials in the labor market. But then as the experiment persisted in the field, the effect turned more and more positive over time. So we're in there's a lot of churn going on in real time right now about how people understand these new modalities for learning and credentials.
And actually, I'm thinking of a couple studies now that have looked at online coursework, not so much online degrees, and found slightly negative outcomes from, but this is, still 5 years ago or something.
Right.
So are things changing now?
The question is compared to what?
Compared to what, that's right.
You could have a world where the online version was a little worse
That's
than
right.
the in-person version, but if you're a student for whom the
Who-
counterfactual
That's
is
right.
nothing.
Is nothing, is it better than nothing?
Or it's the for-profit
That's right.
online program, which is maybe similar quality at a higher price to you, where you're bearing more of the risk.
So we have a question in the back.
Hello, my name is Nanama Anani. I'm a CLEG major and a policy scholar here at AU. Just have a few questions, like 3 questions. The first one is, how are you going to provide normative context for financing higher ed, and how are you going to publicize it? Because for-profit schools use social media and advertisements, and how are you going to take away that negative context from using social media? The other one is, what is the best way for everyday citizens to fight against budget cuts in their local cities? And the other one is, how are you going to make, which is tied to the first question, how are you going to make data more qualitative for everyday citizens? That's it. Thank you.
Any response from panelists?
Well, I could take up the finance, the middle question, which I think is an interesting one, about how can you kind of promote more funding. I think the answer is going to be really context dependent, because we tend to say, there's this homogenous thing called American public schooling, but districts are so heterogeneous, right? 15, 16,000 districts. Some are LA Unified, running 400 high schools and countless elementary schools. How do you get them to, say, raise property taxes? Well, in California, you can't do that anyway. You'd have to get the state to increase its appropriation. But I guess one of the things I would like to encourage, if the idea is to drive meaningful improvements in school performance, there are other closer levels that might be proximate for citizens to improve their schools. In particular, I wanted to mention one of the things we've learned from this era of unusually high-frequency data that's come out of the era of test-based accountability is how much teachers matter, right? Because there's always this sense that that they matter, but the availability of data has really driven home that the heterogeneity is enormous. There's one prominent study recently that found, matching test score data to long-run labor market outcome data, that if you move a child from a classroom with a teacher at the 5th percentile to one at the 50th, it creates just that 1 year in elementary school with a median instead of a bad teacher, increases the labor market success of those students by an amount equivalent to $250,000 in present value. So some of you may have seen this discussion about the $250,000 teacher. So if I were thinking of ways to improve my local school, and particularly in a large district where changing its finances wasn't really something I had much control over, I'd be much more interested in just getting involved in the leadership and culture of that school around recruiting and retaining high-quality teachers and creating a culture of high expectations in that school.
I'd also add to look for opportunities to get rid of programs that aren't working. Where we so often focus, we found this thing and it works, and so let's do more of it.
Yeah.
Let's go find the stuff that, there's a whole wasteland of research on professional development for teachers and how it basically never works. So we should still keep looking for versions of it that do work, and if we find one, do it. But let's go and, let's get rid of all those programs, right? When we have good evidence that stuff isn't working, let's get rid of it. And A, we can plow those resources into things that do work, or the weaker version of this is you find policies or practices that maybe they work, but they're not very cost effective, they're very expensive for what you're getting. So you do less of them, and you do things that give you more bang for the buck. So that both improves kind of productivity and what you're getting. And at the same time, it perhaps builds public trust in government and in public expenditures, and perhaps helps you build a political case for raising taxes and spending more money on things that you think are important.
So I'm going to invite one more question, but I want to respond to your last point about how do you develop additional data on school outcomes, qualitatively in particular. I think one of the pushbacks of the recent data dumps and the expansive use of data for accountability now has been to make that easier to access. So the recent school report card, I think, is not especially easy to access, although it's a lot of fun to look at if you like data. But there are other websites that are making that more transparent. So ProPublica just put out a really nice use of the Department of Ed data, which I think is much easier to use. And there's been a fair amount of pushback on this kind of data as sort of the holy grail or be-all, end-all in thinking about higher ed. The argument being, we know in general that public higher education is a good investment. Let's invest in public higher education without worrying about which school moves the needle a little bit more than others. And so there is that pushback. Wait, one question in the back.
First of all, I would like to, yeah, my voice is loud enough. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming over here all the way to Washington, D.C., even though some of you are D.C. professors. But anyways, my question is in regard to what Professor Chingos talked about earlier about free higher public university education. In regard to that, I've heard a lot of arguments discussing how if we initiated that action in terms of having public universities be free for all, for example, would that make public universities more competitive with private universities? Because on US News, for example, you see that the majority of the top 25 are private universities, but would that change, and would you see that inequity diminish if we made public universities free?
Do you want to
I
go?
could try. I mean, so I think if you made public universities free, that would certainly increase sort of Econ 101. You make something cheaper, right? It increases demand for seats at public institutions. So that could work in a couple different ways. It could divert people who would have gone from a higher quality private institution. I'm not saying on average private institutions are higher quality, but assume for a second someone's going to go to a higher quality private institution, and now they can go to their public university for free or for less money. It's something that actually happened in Massachusetts with the program they enacted there. So if it diverts people to lower quality institutions, it could lead them to have worse outcomes. At the same time, it could make competition more acute for the limited number of seats at public universities if it gets cheaper. So you could have a case where public universities cost less, but they become harder to get into. And because of the correlation between sort of socioeconomic background and academic preparation, you get into a world where the free resource is now going more and more to people who need free the least. So this kind of comes back to this kind of note that I concluded my opening comments on, which is thinking about the design of these particular policies to get you the goal that you want, which in the case of free college is sending a clear message, transparent message that college is accessible to anyone who needs it, and avoiding some of these unintended consequences that might not be what you wanted.
And just to piggyback on that too, when you think about this diversion effect, particularly if we're talking about tuition-free community college, you might in particular be worried that some students who are able to go to a four-year college, take on some debt, they'd be able to pay it back no problem, get diverted with this nice free tuition at a community college, and heaven forbid they have a worse outcome or they don't finish their bachelor's degree, they never take the next step for some reason. We might be concerned that those types of diversion things happen. And the community college can't be as selective with its admissions. Or maybe they would find a way to do that with waiting lists. But in most states, community colleges are open admission, and that's pretty big. So I think how you design it and exactly what you make free and how those incentives are created, and it really matters for what we think how students will shift between them.
So I know there's still more questions, but I'm really attentive to the fact that we run over the time that I told the School of Communications we might run over too, which is 5:30. So I'd like to invite you all to come upstairs for a reception, and our panelists are very approachable, and let's have continue this discussion up there. But thanks very much to the panelists.